Welcome to the Career Intelligence Podcast, where we help you navigate today's job market with confidence and a competitive edge. I'm your host, Kathleen Dohoney, a career coach and owner of Celtic Career Pros. Now, if the thought of negotiating your salary makes you nervous, you're definitely not alone, because many professionals worry they'll lose the job offer simply by asking for more. But what if the biggest mistake isn't negotiating? It's accepting the first offer too quickly. Today, I'm talking with salary negotiation expert and author John Gates, who has spent decades on the recruiting side of the table and knows exactly how employers approach compensation. He's sharing insider strategies to help you negotiate with confidence, protect your earning potential, and maximize your total compensation package. Act your wage. What to say and how to say it to get the best possible salary package. My guest today, John Gates, is here to discuss exactly what that means. And as many of you know, it's a really challenging subject to discuss salary. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Kathleen. So excited to be here with you today. And I think this is going to be fun for the audience too.
Absolutely. Maybe you could start out by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. So I've been a recruiter for most of my career. I started recruiting right out of college, wanted to be a financial analyst. But when I graduated from college with that finance degree, the first company to offer me a job rescinded the offer a couple of weeks before I had to start. And so I had to come up with a plan B for my career and decided just to network like crazy because the job market was pretty bad in those days, kind of like it is today. I mean, it was tough to get started. So I networked my way into a position at a temporary agency, and they hired me to recruit in a Hispanic suburb of Portland. And they hired me because I could speak Spanish, I had a degree, and I looked good in a suit. That was
Fantastic.
kind of it. And so I got my start recruiting in 1990, which is a long time ago, and have been recruiting ever since. And discovered that I had a real knack for it. I was very good at it, and worked for agencies for the first 5 years. Then got into corporate recruiting. Eventually became the head of global recruiting for Fortune 500 companies, and all along the way became the subject matter expert for pay negotiation on the other side of the table. So I was training all the recruiters and HR people on how to negotiate with candidates when extending an offer. And I did that for a few decades and eventually decided to come to the other side of the table, launch Salary Coach a few years ago. And in that business, I help candidates to get the upper hand without losing the offer, without feeling anxiety. It's a very low risk process, but it's easy if you know what to do. It's something that most people never do or do very rarely in their lifetimes, and so I think the average candidate is at a bit of a disadvantage against someone like me, and I want to level the playing field.
So, why did you decide to write this book after so many years? I'm sure you had a lot to share.
Yeah, there was. I wanted to share the basics of the salary coach method that I developed. Wanted to promote Salary Coach as a business. But more than anything, I like to get on stage. I like to talk to groups of people. And being a published author of a best selling book really opens that door. I mean, if anybody is thinking about listening to this and thinking about that path, writing a book about your expertise is a fantastic way to get through those stage gates and get on the stage and talk about what you know.
So, many job seekers are terrified that
Mhm.
asking for more money will cause the company to rescind the job offer
Mhm.
entirely, or they're laid off and just feel, I'll take anything. How common is
Mhm.
that?
Very common. I would say most people have that fear. Maybe even all people have that fear, and they convince themselves they don't have that fear. But the biggest disaster of all when you're in a job hunt is to have a job that you want pulled away from you over something like a pay negotiation. Most people will avoid that risk entirely by not negotiating at all. When I first started tracking the data when I was a recruiter, at least 80% of people never negotiate at all. They don't even try.
Wow.
That's a large number. And about 10% negotiate kind of disastrously, and they have impacts, whether it's to their reputation or the job offer itself. And about 10% of people negotiate very effectively. And so those are the numbers that I see on the other side of the table. But it's fear of losing that offer that is a massive deterrent to learning this skill and to even trying it. But I can tell you it's very rare when companies rescind offers. It does happen. You probably heard stories of it happening, and that's why you're afraid. But it's very rare, and I can even talk about what usually causes that if you think it would be interesting.
Yeah, no, I think that'd be great. I think to start with, when an application form sort of forces people to put in a number, they feel they're
Mhm.
tied to that, or a recruiter explicitly asks, "What is your salary expectation?" And I think people just give a hard, fast number and feel that's it. But what's a strategy that you would suggest for
Well,
candidates?
the basics of the salary coach method will describe using a range in those early questions instead of responding with a number. And because you're right, Kathleen, if you get that question either in an application or on a phone screen, somebody calls you and says, "Hey, Kathleen, I got your resume. Would love to talk to you about this amazing opportunity. But before we get too far down the path, what is your pay expectation here?" Everybody knows this is a question that you can flunk out on. The screener can decide not to move you forward. People lowball themselves here all the time because they're afraid of that. And so if you give a number and it's a low number, very often you don't know how to wiggle your way out of that throughout the process and you feel stuck with that number. Feels like a no-win scenario. So the best approach, the best practice here is to answer that question with a range when it comes at you. So, for example, instead of saying you want 100,000 or 500,000, answering with a number, you can say something like, "Well, I'm having discussions on similar positions with other companies, and the range that I'm discussing with them is between 185 and 240. That's the general range I'm discussing with other companies right now." That's usually enough to satisfy a screener as long as they think they can land somewhere in that range. The question they're trying to answer in their own mind is, "Can I get you?" And if they feel like there's no way they can get you if you said 180 to 240 and the very top of their range is 120, there's just too much of a gap there and they'll just push you out. So what you want to try to do is get your range to overlap with theirs. And another best practice is to, if their range is published or you're able to get the range out of them during this call, make the top end of your range above the top end of theirs. And the reason why is because companies very rarely will reveal the true top of the range. There's almost always some extra, even if they insist not a penny more. I've seen it happen time and time again. If a hiring manager really wants someone, they can often make that adjustment unless you're going into a group where there are lots of equity issues and things like that. So,
Sometimes the application requires a hard, fast number. I'm not sure
mhm,
you've heard that.
of
What would
course, I
be,
go
yeah,
ahead, Kathleen.
no, what would be the kind of the tip for that? Because it's not allowing a range or NA or anything else.
Of course. Yeah, I've deployed many applicant tracking systems for companies, configured those very data fields. So I know exactly what you're talking about. There's one of three possibilities when you're in an application in general. Like one is it's going to require you to put a number in. If you put anything else in, you can't submit your application. That's the most common. The next is there are drop down lists with ranges, and you pick one of those that most closely matches what you're looking for. And the third is an open text box where you can kind of type in whatever you want to type in. And if it's open text, you can put in the range and you could say something like 180 to 240 total comp, depending, or something like that, right? So depending on the job duties, depending on the location, depending on travel requirements, that kind of stuff. Now, if you have to put in a number, put in a number that's kind of medium low for you. So everybody in this call is going to have a different number in mind when I talk about medium low. But just rest assured that if you do this the way that the salary coach method advises, you won't be stuck with that number. So what you specifically have to do is use that number to get a phone call. And then when you get the phone call, you have to reposition into a range during that call. When they ask again what your pay expectation is, or they start talking about pay, then you can say, well, I had to put, 150 in the box just to get my application submitted. But really, the range I'm discussing with other companies is 150 to 210 or whatever. And you do something like that to shift into a range. And if they don't ask you about money, you should bring it up in that phone call. Because if you don't, you're going to be stuck with a number.
Right. And then I know you talked about that in the book, and along with some examples of short scripts that can help you through that process. And I think that's an important point. You will get stuck with that number because the recruiter assumes that that's what you want. They're not going to go and vet you any further. So I like that
Exactly.
idea.
If they think they can get you for that number, they'll write it on your resume, in your file, go somewhere. And when the hiring manager is then reviewing your resume, they're looking at a note from the recruiter that says, "Hey, we can get Kathleen for 180."
Right.
And that's that's what they have. And so that's what they're thinking they're going to have to offer. When it comes time to get that offer approved, that's what they put through for approval. And then sometimes this is where offers fall apart. If they come in at 180 and now you try to negotiate, it makes you look two-faced at the end. That's another reason why it's important to to lead with a range, and then during the process you can move up in your own range without any feelings of like you're backtracking or you lied to me or anything like that.
And one of the things that you spend some considerable amount of time is talking about compensation overall. I think people get hung up on salary. Share with us, John, really what you meant by that.
Great. And I agree with you. Most of the candidates I've worked with throughout the years are thinking about the salary that they're going to get, and they don't really think about the whole package that is going to be included. So recruiters spend a lot of time selling this, but I'll back up into a story about myself here for a minute. I once worked as an IT recruiting team leader for Capital One, and this was right before Y2K. So IT recruiting was really hot, especially finding those COBOL programmers to fix all the mainframes. Everyone was afraid they would break at midnight on the eve of 2000, right? So we were all competing for these folks, but Capital One had a compensation philosophy, just like every other company does. And their philosophy was, we're going to pay at the 90th to 95th percentile when you consider our entire package. So we are going to be a pay leader, but in terms of base salary, we're only going to pay at the 50th percentile, which means our base salaries are average. But when you add in the annual cash bonus, the stock award, the 401k match, all these other things that pile in, they were very aggressive on the incentives, and that like a total pay package might go from a 70,000 a year salary up to that could expand to be $150,000 total package with all the incentives added in. So if you're trying to recruit a consultant or somebody who's making $90,000 a year and you offer them 70,000 in base, feels like a mismatch, but you're actually well overwhelming the 90K. So it's important for everyone to understand that every company has a different bundle of things. Sometimes they're one-time offers, like the signing bonus might be something that you get once and then it's gone. Salary is ongoing. Annual bonuses are ongoing, but with some risk. Stock is often ongoing, but sometimes only one time. And usually there's vesting periods. And it gets kind of complicated. But a great way to dive into this, just give the audience another language tip, something that you can use, is when you get that question about what's your pay expectation and the phone call, you could say something like this. And this is what I might recommend in my book or to my coaching clients. You can say something like, well, I'm glad that you asked that question because I'm looking forward to a really transparent conversation with you about pay. But first, can you tell me what your budget is for the position? And then you have to be quiet for about 8 seconds. And if you look at your watch for 8 seconds, that's a long time. But people tend to fill in that silence with their voice. They become a little uncomfortable after a few seconds, and this is
Absolutely.
okay.
Mhm.
They'll give you some information, and usually it's going to be some sort of a range. Unless it's a very low level position where they might say, well, it's $22.68 an hour. Usually for a salary position, they'll give you some sort of a range. And here's the next question you ask. When they give you the range, you should say, is that salary only or are there incentives in addition to that? And if they say there are incentives and there's no more information, you can say, well, could you tell me about that? I'd like to understand how that affects the total package. And so on. This is not a line of communication that anyone on this call should be afraid of. This kind of thing, this question is what recruiters get all day long. You know, if you're a recruiter, you're gonna talk to lots of people every day. You're gonna ask that question, hear the answer. You kind of like it when people are curious about how the pay structure works or how the benefits work. It's not annoying at all. So don't think you're going to annoy the person by asking. If you use these kind of words and you're not a jerk about it, they'll be happy to tell you what it is. And then you can calculate it. So if the base pay is 100 and then there's 30% of incentives more on top, then you can say, well, okay, so it sounds like the total package is worth more like 130. Is that about right? Or 130 to 165. Is that about right? And then when they say yes, then you can go back into uh, that script and you can say, well, that's great because the numbers that I'm talking about with other companies are between like 140 and 180. And so since we have a lot of overlap, I think we should move forward. This sounds great to me. And again, you're just trying to make yourself seem gettable. That's all the screener wants to know is can they get you? They do not want to tie up interview time with short staff leaders only to have a salary or pay mismatch at the end. That's the worst egg on the face of a recruiter.
What I really appreciated was the way you framed it is a little more of a collaborative approach. I think we have been ingrained all our lives. Don't ever ask about salary. It's a taboo subject going into a pre-screen of any kind. And how you ask, I think, is the way it's not a demand, but more in a conversation. Much better approach.
Yeah. Thank you. That's all throughout the salary coach method is a focus on collaboration and discussion and just mutual discovery instead of um, a high stakes game of chicken, which is what most people think negotiation is, that it's just super risky, that you're giving an ultimatum or that you have to strap on a bunch of armor and walk into an arena and duel to the death. It doesn't have to be that way, but most people think that's what it is and they want no part of it.
I've actually had a client once actually say to me what he told recruiters, I don't get out of bed for X.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me was very arrogant and
Mm-hmm.
that he was worth that without them even knowing anything about him.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I think that's important to tell people right now is you shouldn't make giant demands because the screener they're not sold on you. It takes zero effort for them to click a button on a screen saying no. And nobody's in love with you yet. You have to create that relationship with the hiring manager before you can come in with a higher level of value. And I once had a guy tell me that too. It's a sales leader who had changed jobs maybe 10 times in his lifetime. He just says, I tell these recruiters when they call that I need at least $300,000 package. And if it's not that, I'm not interested. And for him, 300,000 was a fairly aggressive number. So he thinks he's winning, but he's actually losing. And this is why. Um, let's say the screener knows that the package is not likely to go above 280, then they don't believe they can get him. So they just hit that ejection button and say no. So if it's too high, it's going to be a no. But what happens if the package could be worth 360? Now they write 300 on the application, just like we discussed earlier, and you'll think you're getting the best offer when you're actually getting a low ball and you didn't know it. If you use a range, you can avoid that risk altogether and you can get into the process, prove your value, and come out with a stronger offer at the end.
So out in the wide world of the internet, there are loads of salary boards and salary information. I
Mhm.
know some of it's regional, depends on the company. And you and I had a conversation about gig work and consulting.
Mhm.
Uh, how does that play into someone that's looking for consulting or contract roles? What are some go-to tools or strategies for benchmarking what they're worth?
Yeah, it's tough to benchmark what you're worth when you're consulting, unless you're offering a product that is uh, duplicated by a lot of other people. And you really don't want to do that. So when it comes to consulting and gig work and things like that, I think when people are going to ask you for what's your rate, how much is this going to cost before they go into a substantial conversation. But I teach this in my course. I have a course called The Crossroads, which helps people to launch a consulting business in 6 weeks. And one of the lessons in that is how to adjust your prices and how to right size your prices so you're not stealing money from yourself. This happens to a lot of new gig workers, a lot of new consultants. Imposter syndrome will eat your lunch and you'll underprice yourself almost forever. There are a couple of things to think about. First, when they ask you what your rate is, you can say, well, it depends on what the job is. So let's have a detailed conversation about the scope of work, what you need, by when. And you should be familiar enough with this kind of work to where you can know if it's too aggressive, if it's going to be a cakewalk, what is it going to be? And you can ask a bunch of other questions, like, for example, what happens to the company if that's not achieved on time? You're fishing a little bit for the economic value of this work to the company. So if they want you to work on a project for 6 months and at the end, if it's delivered on time, then that's going to save them $5 million a year or every year after that, then you base your price somewhat on that value. So if they like you and they see that you have a track record of doing this kind of work and they believe that you can hit that deadline and even if it's aggressive, whatever, they might, instead of saying I charge $80 an hour, that's almost always going to steal money from yourself. You should price it by the job and say, I'm going to charge you a retainer up front, something along the middle of the project at a milestone, and something at the end. And the total fee for saving you $5 million in a year is going to be $400,000 for the project, end to end, all in. And, whereas $80 an hour might have been 60 grand. People are willing to spend money as an investment if you learn this skill and are able to kind of extract the value, uh, convince them that it's going to be more expensive not to hire you than to hire you. And the other rule of thumb that I think is important here is set your price to a point where you're mildly uncomfortable with that if you're gig working. Because we tend to steal money from ourselves, even if it's a gig where it is gonna be by the hour, you're just staff augmentation, you're coming in to do the regular department work. They don't wanna set milestones, they're just gonna bring you in. Go for a price that makes you mildly uncomfortable, that you offer in your comfort zone because of imposter syndrome and fear and worry. You're almost always gonna underprice yourself. And you could still offer a range, to convince them to have deeper discussions with you about the project. And then you can say, "Hey, we'll tighten this up once I'm selected for the project or once I'm a finalist."
So let's kind of circle back now. An offer finally comes your way.
Mhm.
Now what? What can you share for our listeners on some ways to not jump and say yes right away and accept?
Well,
Because they're like,
that's
yay, I got
really
the offer.
that's really the key bit of advice here. And I'd say the best thing you can do is to pick up the phone and call me, and I'll help you through. But assuming you don't want to do that, and you want to handle it on your own, my advice here is don't accept the offer immediately. Most people do that. I mentioned 80% of people don't negotiate at all. Almost all of them are accepting the offer immediately. And this is why. And you really have to check yourself. You got to be careful here. The job search has a way of wearing us out. We're so tired of being in between, of worrying and sleepless nights of how we're going to pay our bills, things like this. And this pushes you into just removing all of the risk. As soon as there's a job offer in front of you, you could choose to dismiss all of this uncertainty from your life with just one word, and that's yes. And there's this huge emotional temptation to do that immediately, just to get rid of it and go celebrate with your family and then thank God I'm no longer doing this, right? So that's a big mistake to do that. And so instead ask for a couple of days to consider the offer and then tell them that you're going to study the offer carefully. You'd like to see it in writing. And then you need to build a list of questions, and the questions should be targeting, they should be poking at the offer a little bit. Ask if this is included. Is that included? What's the max? How is that calculated? And if you ask the right questions, which I coach my clients into asking, that can show you where they're firm and where they're flexible in their offer. And very often companies will signal to you that they can put together something different or new. If you start asking a bunch of questions and they start signaling this is the best we can do, this is the firm offer, which is probably about 10 or 15% of the time, honestly, then you've tested the offer a little bit. You know that you've already got the best offer they can make. But 90% of the time, there's always something. They're holding back something to close you because they're not entirely sure you're going to say
Right.
yes. And honestly, they want a yes out of you as much as you want to say yes. And you can withhold your yes for a few days in exchange for a couple of things. The most leverage and power that you have during this entire process is between the time that they offer you the job and when you say yes. So think about it that way. You can withhold your yes in exchange for information, commitments, and you can negotiate on a lot of fronts. It doesn't have to be just pay. You could negotiate for more vacation time sometimes, or this holiday that you have planned with family that's 9 months away that you don't want to cancel, or buying you out of stuff that you're leaving on the table at your current company, start date, job title, even budget. I've had some of my clients say, I think that I need more budget to achieve the goals that they're asking me to achieve.
Mm.
Well, if you're going to ask for that, Now is the time to do that before you say yes. Once you say yes, everything disappears in terms of leverage. You're stuck with what you got and hope you're happy with that. But if you discover you don't have enough uh, headcount in your group, you don't have enough budget, this is the time to try to get that stuff because honestly, they want to put the search to bed just as much as you do. They don't want to go back. Most companies take 60 days or longer to fill a salary position. If it's an executive role, it might be 4 months. It takes that long. And that vacancy is painful for them. So remember that.
And would you recommend that once that's ironed out, they get a new offer letter so that it's all clearly in writing?
Absolutely. So if you are able to put in some agreeable changes to the offer, what about this? What about that? Could this happen? Then revise the written offer and I'll sign it. If you can get that back to me in writing by today, I'll sign it and we're ready to go. We can start talking about onboarding. That's what they want. And so for some of these positions, a $20,000 signing bonus is a rounding error in a department's budget sometime for some jobs, right? If we were talking about a C-suite position, that would actually be a really small signing bonus.
Yeah.
A lot of those are six figures even just to get a yes out of a person.
So share with us, I would say, if you can think, top 5 mistakes I think people either leave on the table, make a judgment error, and what would those be when they're
Oh,
trying to
okay.
negotiate?
We've already hit a couple of them, so I'll
Mhm.
reiterate those. One is using a number instead of a range early on. That
Okay.
really hamstrings you. So avoid that mistake. The second one is accepting the offer immediately. Avoid that mistake. And then when you get into offer negotiation itself, I think there are a lot of ways people miss opportunities. And I'm very good at looking at an offer letter and seeing what's missing. And that's sometimes hard to find if you've only worked for 3 or 4 companies in your whole life. You might think, well, my old company used to do this. It's not here. You might be just so emotionally excited about the offer that you forget to look at the 401k match or the vacation allotment. You don't realize that the 5 weeks of vacation time they're offering you is you have no vacation. You're starting in July. There's no vacation until you get a new allowance in January. And those are the kind of details that trip you up. Proration is another thing that's really common to overlook. And most people don't think about this. So if you start a new job in July, you're halfway through the year. Your first bonus, if it was based on a calendar year, is almost always going to be prorated based on your month of hire or your hire date. That's negotiable, by the way. Many, many times I've been able to coach my clients through the process of getting the proration waived. How much money they're going to give you, buying you out of stock that's unvested and things like that. There's a lot of options there. It seems like about half my clients these days are interviewing with private equity owned companies.
Okay.
And I'm seeing a real trend there. So if you are interviewing with a company that is owned by a private equity company, so this is an investor that's come in and they bought the company. Usually they're going to hold the company for 3 to 5 years and they're going to try to sell it for more than they bought it for. And sometimes the reason they're hiring new leaders is because they think the old leaders can't get them that valuation increase. New leaders will be able to do that. But here's the risk. Let's say you're a chief financial officer or chief information officer for a company that is owned by private equity. They're going to sell that company in 3 years, maybe 2. What happens to you when that sale happens and you're in a staff function and the company that's buying you already has a CFO, they already have a CIO, they already have an HR department. The risk is very high And the private equity companies know that the risk is high for people that they're trying to hire. They also know they're probably going to have to pay a premium so that you'll take on that risk. And if you don't understand that you have that leverage or leverage like that, that's the sort of thing that can really cost you money. And then 2 years later, you get laid off again, and now you're looking for another job. You didn't get the right kind of parachute. That's the sort of thing that having a coach in your corner can really help you see.
So we've got a few minutes left, John. Anything else that you would like to share with those who I know your book is of great value, Act Your Wage, and we'll have these links in the show notes. Anything else that you think that would be really helpful for our listeners?
Sure. If there's anybody listening and you have a unique question, something that wasn't answered in the course of the podcast, you just want some advice, you're welcome to reach out to me personally. You can do that. And I also think too, in this weird economic time, this is the weirdest job market that I have seen in my 30-year recruiting career. There are extended periods of uncertainty with companies that's impacting a lot of hiring. So if it looks like what you thought would be a 3-month unemployment is starting to stretch on, you really should think about launching a consulting business in the interim for a couple of reasons. Like, I just want to leave with this idea. First, it makes you seem employed and not unemployed. This is important for executive search firms. They don't often want to engage people who are not employed. But if you got a good side gig going, it's profitable, things like that. Now you're employed and they're more likely to engage with you. But you can also bring in some revenue in the interim. It might even turn into your new plan A. So if that's something you're thinking about, I can help you with that too. But there are lots of resources on how to start your own consulting thing. Just be careful not to starve to death for your first couple of years. You can't, like I did when I first started consulting. That was the first 2 years was tough because I didn't know how to do that. And now I do.
Well, this has been a great discussion. I think very timely. People are feeling a little bit of a desperation, as you can see everywhere and in the news posted. People are just feeling battle weary from the long process of interviewing and then it not getting to the close to the end. So I think what you're sharing is there's still, even in this economy, is the ability to negotiate.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something that the economy will try to dissuade you from doing.
Mm,
You feel even more desperate. When times are good and you've got 2 or 3 offers coming in, you feel more bold, right?
right.
But there is a way that you can, and I think it's critical in any job search. Even if you've got nothing going on, you have to show the company that you got something going on. Having a consulting business, being in discussions with other companies, those are all the things they expect to see from strong talent. Somebody who shows up with no options, nothing in the pipeline, they seem desperate. Screeners and hiring managers start to have second thoughts about people like that because they wonder why somebody hasn't grabbed you yet. And they're employed, so they don't realize how weird the job market is right now. They just think about what it was like during the Great Resignation a few years ago. It was really hard to get talent. Some of them still think that's the way it is out there, that it's easy
Yes.
to get a job if you're really good. I'm seeing a lot of really good people sit around for a while. And
Right.
if you're one of those really good people, it's got to make you a little scared, but you don't have to give up your negotiating leverage just because of that.
Well, John, thank you so much for your time today. And this was super valuable. As I said, we'll put all of your information and how to get your book in the show notes. And thank you again.
Thank you, Kathleen. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, John, for sharing your expertise and practical advice with our listeners today. Negotiating compensation doesn't have to feel uncomfortable or confrontational. It simply can be a thoughtful business conversation. In today's discussion, I truly hope that this gives you confidence to ask better questions, understand your value, and approach your next offer strategically. You can find links to John's book, Act Your Wage, and his resources in today's show notes. And if you're ready to take the next step in your career journey, I'm here to help. Through personalized coaching, I support professionals in meeting their career goals. You will find my contact information in the show notes. Enjoyed this episode? Then follow the Career Intelligence podcast and share it with someone who has been wondering what AI means for their future. Thanks so much for listening. We will be back soon with another episode. In the meantime, stay curious, keep learning, and keep building your career intelligence.